life. The spice expands consciousness.
Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer. This is Dr. Greer, and I'm joined today with Lindy Tucker, and I'd like to thank the people at the World Puja Network for hosting us every 2 weeks on this program, and we have a worldwide people listening about what the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence is doing, and the OrionProject.org on the new energy research, and also, of course, DisclosureProject.org. So I would like to introduce Lindy Tucker as our guest today. She is an amazing woman who's been involved in the ET issue for many decades, and in fact, I've met her in the very early days of forming CSETI.org. And as you all know, CSETI was formed in 1990, and I believe I met Lindy Tucker in 1991, and she had an encounter, which she's going to be sharing with you, that resulted in the recording of, as many of you have heard, these very interesting electromagnetic sort of beeping tones, which has been a recurring theme, which we're going to go into and drill really deep on today. So without much further ado, I'd like to welcome Lindy Tucker to the show. Thank you for being here.
Well, hi, Stephen. And yes, we do go back 20 years now.
Yeah, 20 years that we met. And even that had a whole series of mysterious connections that you were reminding me of just before we went on the air. So why don't you start with that and you know how we met and the circumstances.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was there was a MUFON conference in Chicago in 1991, and you were there. I was there. Colin Andrews was there presenting with his tones from the crop circles, and we all decided to get together and share our research. And so we met in the lobby Sunday morning for 2 hours, and everybody was bringing us bagels and orange juice while we took notes and, got our research followed. And then everybody went their way. And a couple of days later, I called you at your home here in Asheville. By the way, I'm living in Asheville now.
Right. North Carolina, she's saying, yeah.
Yes. And I called you just to reintroduce myself to you as I normally do. And you had a really interesting story to tell me because you had heard the beeping sounds just a couple of days before up in Chicago. And you told me that when you got home, you were sitting at your kitchen table with Emily, your wife, here in Asheville because you lived here at the time. And the beeping sounds came in an open window, went around you and Emily and the table, and went back out the window again.
Absolutely, and I remember that clear as a bell. We were at our big house in Biltmore Forest next to the Biltmore Estate, and there was very clearly a tonality, a beeping tones that came in and literally circumambulated us. I'm pretty sure in a counterclockwise direction. That was clear as a bell that both my wife and I heard, and we had just been talking, of course, with Lindy Tucker about the tones that she had recorded in Canada back, I believe, in the 70s or 80s. We'll get into that in a moment. And with, of course, Colin Andrews, who, this was in 1991, had just come over to the States with these tones that had been recorded in 1989 in a crop circle. And as all of you know, one of the protocols that we use for making contact with the ETs, in addition to remote viewing and higher states of consciousness, is that we transmit out into space these beeping tones that were the result of an event in a crop circle where a BBC news crew actually recorded, along with other people, these tones that were coming out of thin air. And along with it were a lot of electromagnetic anomalies, in fact, so much so that I think the beta cams that the BBC were using suffered some $70,000 in damage to the cameras. But that Pat Delgado was actually at one point almost being pulled like in an anti-gravity sort of field, a vortex of energy, and that this was clearly an anomalous event that was quite remarkable, and this has continued to this day. And we're going to really focus on tonality. And of course, those of you who know about the pujas and Sanskrit and mantras know that tonality is key. That tonality and sound precedes form and light and matter, and that the cosmology that we've been writing about for the last 20 years or so heavily involves, these concepts and the concepts of tonality and how that has a connection to interstellar technologies and consciousness. So this is all going to be brought together. I think there'll be some dots connected for everyone. So that's what we'll be focusing on during this next hour.
Well, I thought that was fabulous when you told me that it seems to be aware not only of, who you are and where you are, but what you're doing. And so for you to be included immediately into the beeping sounds, I thought was a sign for me. And if you remember, while we were discussing that, your daughter Carmel was running down the stairs saying, "Daddy, Daddy, there's this huge UFO over the house."
Right.
And we both started laughing. We were engaged in the conversation, and we didn't bother to go look out the window. You know that type of thing happens, and I know that type of thing happens. So we were more or less just in agreement that whatever we were discussing and whatever we would be doing together was going to be important.
Right. And this is how the ETs do these kind of affirmations or confirmations when people are being connected on to something that's true and critical and essential to understanding transdimensional sciences faster than sciences, and also understanding the multiplicity of ways in which civilizations make contact with humans. And this is what's really important about this, is that it's not just a sound like you would hear from a truck backing up or something. There is a conveyance of, you're having contact, and there's actually an association in consciousness. And behind the tone is an intelligence coming from these interstellar civilizations. And it's really, really amazing that this did happen right after I met Colin Andrews and got the tones to use in our research, and Lindy Tucker. Lindy, why don't you tell people about how the tones that you have, the experience you had, because it's such an amazing encounter that happened, and I can't remember the dates. It seems like it was back in the 70s or 80s.
35 years ago.
Yeah. Why don't you share that? It's an amazing account of your contact.
Well, they were actually contacts, and in the beginning I wasn't sure what was happening to me. I felt normal, but I lived out in a very remote area of southern Ontario at the time. The town was called Orton,
right,
Ontario, and it was where the headwaters of the Seed River started, and the headwaters of southern Ontario were all in that area, which is something that is important because of the crop circles that appeared later. But 1975, I just had a normal life. I was upstairs reading a book and got a very strong impression that if I got dressed, put my coat on, went outside, that I would see something. And so this was March 3rd, 1975. And, it was such a peculiar feeling. I put the book down, went outside, and looked out the back door, and there were 3 really brilliant lights just hanging off the horizon, and sort of mesmerized. I looked at them and couldn't figure out what they were. I called to, my husband and neighbor at the time. They were upstairs. They came out, and we were watching them for several minutes and couldn't figure out what they were. And they all sort of joined together into one and blinked out. Okay, I just sort of scratched my head, went in, forgot about it. But a week later, I was washing dishes, and I got that strange feeling again that there was something out there.
Right.
And I had to go out the back door and look, and this time there were 5 of them. And that was the beginning of the contact, and I always knew when they were coming, and even hours ahead. And they were just, basically very brightly colored dancing lights. They would, there'd be several of them, 3, 5, 6, 7. They would dart about. They would join together. They would move around in angular and triangular movements. And then along with that came these large, gaseous, orange balls of light that would approach approach me on the ground, and I felt that they were sentient.
Right.
And they would stop me in my tracks because...
How big were they?
Well, I'd say about the size of a beach ball, maybe a little larger, within a 3-foot diameter.
Right.
And then there was, we had sort of like these filaments of air, what do you call it, like spider webs that would come down and just hang off the trees. But after that...
How close did these spheres get to you? I mean, how far away were they?
I would say that they never came any closer than probably 40 or 50 feet.
Okay.
And I wouldn't approach them. They would stop me dead in my tracks. Frankly, I respected it, whatever it was.
Right.
But about after 2 months of these sightings, a strange beeping sound started happening out in the woods behind our home. And it was very piercing, very loud, very metallic. It sort of reminded me of the sonar from a submarine.
Right.
Where you have that high-pitched rotational quality to it. And I didn't know what to make of it. It had me confused. I felt that, somebody was way back in the woods with some, type of electronic equipment, maybe a ham radio operator or something, and just never could place it. And so I told my neighbors about it, and they're going, well, Lindy's seeing lights now. She's hearing sounds, and they were making fun of me. And I said, well, the next time I hear it, I'm going to call you. So one night we were, my neighbors and I and my husband were sitting out in front of the garden, and it was a beautiful spring evening. It was actually, I remember it very well. It was May 19th, 1975, which, the whole atmosphere, there was electricity in the air. The dogs were barking, the chickens were barking, the roosters were crowing, and you could hear the cows bawling for miles. It was really an excitement in the air.
Right.
And, a couple of hours later, I was cleaning up, and I was, taking the garbage out, and I heard the beeping sounds, and I figured, I got to get my neighbors. So I went and, called them up. It was 12:30 at night by then, and they came over, and we were looking into the woods behind my house, and we could see these red lights in behind the trees, and there's nothing out there. There's nothing for miles, and so we were, do you see those red lights? Yeah, I see those red lights, and then one of them rose directly out of the woods, stopped a little above the tree line, and started to, it made a 90-degree angle turn, and it started to come towards us in an arc. And I decided to go get a quicker look at it because the spotlights from the house were on, and I didn't want my shadow cast, but I ran in front of a shed we had, and I got a good look at it as it came over us. And it was a metallic craft, about 30 feet across, and I'd say probably had about a 12-foot dome on top, and it was lit. It was a soft white light. But what really got me was you could see the rotating red light going around the rim of this craft.
Right. I've seen exactly that. Right.
Counterclockwise, and I could count the lights. There was like 3 and 2 and 3 and 2, and I went, okay, I'm getting out of here. And went back to my neighbors, and they were all paralyzed too. And it was sort of like the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Our knees were wobbling, and we were all excited. And but as we became fearful of it, it moved off. It changed direction and went off to the north.
Right.
So that was where I put the sound and the craft together. That
right. Sure.
So the thing is
that when you made the recording?
No, actually, the beeping sounds continued throughout the summer and even into the next year, but it was not always wasn't always there, and the nights that it did happen were quite unusual. The sound was so loud that you could hear it with the doors and the windows closed, even up to probably a quarter of a mile away, maybe half a mile away.
Right.
And so I started making some inquiries. I reported my contact to MUFON Canada, and they brought a biologists out, and I contacted Chris Purton, who was professor of astronomy out at York University, and he said, well, I didn't have a tape recorder, but he said, well, next time you hear it, I'll come out with my tape recorder. So him and his wife, I called them one night. They came over. We checked his tape recorder in the house. They brought over a flashlight and some matches with my candle. And I said, what have you got those for? And they said, well, these kind of things, sometimes they knock out the power on the tape recorder. And I thought, well, okay. So we head out there. And we got within, I'd say, a couple 100 feet of the source of the sound, and he couldn't record it for the life of him. The machine jammed. We were frustrated. We're out there with the matches and the candle and couldn't figure out what was happening. So we moved further away, closer back to the house, and we were able to get a short recording, a minute and a half of it, actually. And I have the original recording here with me. Now, mind you, it's 35 years old. It's on cassette tape, but I'm going to have some better copies of this soon. If I could actually play this.
Yeah, we'll do that in a moment. I wanted to ask you a couple other things. Now, when you'd hear, this one time you heard them, and then you saw the red lights in the woods, and then this craft moved overhead. These other times, was there anything visible when you would hear the tones, or there was nothing visible?
No, there was nothing visible.
Okay.
However, there were electromagnetic effects.
Yes. What were those?
And when you encountered the sound, your heart would start racing, at least with me it would. Other people wanted to go near it and follow me out into the woods. Others would just go back in the house. They couldn't stand the sound. But you would become energized moving towards the sound. You would not only hear it, but you would sort of feel it in your chest, like your bones, it was like your solar plexus. It would go right through you. The sound was very piercing.
Right.
But anything that you took that was battery operated, whether it was a flashlight, one of the fellows had a hearing aid, anything run by batteries would go dead within about 150-foot to 200-foot radius of the sound.
Yes, we have this happen all the time. In fact, we were just in Orange County in a canyon by Irvine Lake where we were having contact last weekend, and we had exactly that happen. We have some photographs of these objects that were coming very close to us, and we heard a very high-pitched tone, and we had very brand-new batteries and everything. Our detectors, our magnetometers, the cameras, the video with the night scope, everything died. The detector I had just had brand new batteries put in it, had only been on a few minutes, and they were completely dead. And this is a phenomenon that's been reported all over the world, and it has to do with an area of physics where you're dealing with an electromagnetic field that is sub-zero in the sense that it's beyond the crossing point of light, and it actually has this electromagnetic effect where it does cause this effect. And of course, anyone who's studied this, many people who have been driving close to one of these objects will suddenly have their car just stop and or slow down and then start back up again. And in fact, in Joshua Tree, and we're going to be actually in Joshua Tree again in November, but the first year we went to Joshua Tree National Park, which is this 800,000-acre park up in the high desert of California, we had about a 200-foot diameter disc that came straight down out of the zenith of the sky and went into and merged into the earth transdimensionally. But everyone saw this. It was quite visible. And it was sort of a teal blue color. It was beautiful, not quite solid. It was at the edge of fully materializing into linear space-time. So it was almost like a plasma-like effect, but it looked like a flat on the bottom. It looked like a Hershey's Kiss, actually. Came up to sort of a dome, and then with this trailing, scintillating light as it went straight down. It didn't come down at an angle. It came straight down and went into the earth, and that's when the ET showed us their underground facility up in this huge national park that now we go to every year. Well, when that happened, just seconds before that happened, I was driving a car out of this one canyon up to that area because I was intuitively being guided to move to another spot. In fact, I was told to by contact and sort of a telepathic contact with the ETs. And what happened is that the dashboard, and I had one of my daughters in the back seat, and Sherry was beside me. This was back in 1996. And just before this sighting and just before this craft virtually landed 2,000 feet in front of us and went into the earth, all the lights and all the car, it's like if you had all your lights on a car on a dimmer switch where you could turn it down and then turn it back up. That's what they did. They went like that. And I turned to everyone in the car and I said, there's a craft about to materialize very nearby. And then right after those words left my mouth, this object came straight into the earth. And so this effect with the batteries, I'm so glad you bring this up, because this is a true phenomenon that our contact team, the CE5 initiative, which is the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, where we've gone all over the world to invite these ETs to connect with us for the purposes of universal peace and sort of an exchange between our people and these other civilizations. We have had this happen literally thousands of times. I'm not exaggerating when I say thousands of times that we've had this sort of electromagnetic effect, and it just happened a couple weeks ago at this canyon up in Irvine, California, and it's really quite an amazing thing to see when it happens, because you're thinking, what is wrong with my equipment? But it is, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just part of the phenomenon.
Yes, and and I'm sure that you would agree with me, when you encounter this, you carry a charge as well.
Absolutely, that's right.
Period of time.
And you mentioned the heart. I'm a medical doctor, emergency doctor, and I can tell you that the heart is electromagnetic, and the pulse going through the heart is an electromagnetic pulse. In fact, that's why when your heart stops, we defibrillate you with a big shock of electricity at a certain frequency and a certain amount of electrical power, because the heart is electric. And the bundle of His, which is, where anyway, I won't go into all the anatomy of it, but it is an electrical system. And that's why people have these experiences both in consciousness and with some of these things you're experiencing. In this account you're sharing about the heart speeding up or what have you, with a very, very close encounter with a craft or with the tonalities of these sort of tones. It's really, I love it, but of course if you're not prepared for it, people, this is one of the reasons why when we do these week-long intensives, we go through a lot of this kind of phenomenon so people understand what it means to have close contact, not only with the beings and their technologies that teleport them around, but also with the craft, because there's a whole constellation of this kind of phenomenon, an epiphenomenon that associates contact.
Wow, the energy is really unique. When I would come away from listening to the beeping sounds and being very close to it, and I would also like to mention that my cats were fascinated with the sound, and they often used to beat me down to the bush, and they'd be sitting on the fence post, facing, just in awe as well.
Right, absolutely. And the animals, and I love what you shared about when the sighting started and you were sitting out and all the animals in the area. We have found that whenever this is about to happen, the cows get excited, the coyotes, all the animals become very excited. They know that, and they're picking up on it on a subtle electromagnetic field that most humans are not in touch with, but you notice that dogs and cats and other animals, which live closer to nature than most modern humans do, are very in touch with that kind of energy. And I'm sure our ancestors were, but, modern humans living in the way we do kind of get out of touch with those subtle energies. But they pick up on it right away and do get very excited.
Well, I would come back from the field charged, and if I, would get back to the house, I'd put a compass in my hand, and the compass would spin, or I'd look at the clock on the wall, and I could stop the clock.
Right.
And, sometimes going by, light bulbs they'd either go out or they'd blow out, and there were times when my toaster would just start glowing, and it wouldn't even be, it'd be plugged in, but it wouldn't be turned on, and yet the filaments on it would be lit up. And I occasionally would have trouble where, the battery in the car would go absolutely dead, and it'd be a new battery. There were periods of time that I had some really unusual phenomena happen, but it was off and on for a couple of years there, and eventually we moved out of the area. And, I basically didn't talk about my experiences much because I got some very strange looks. This is back in the mid-'70s before, UFOs were even discussed publicly. That was the mid-'80s, I think.
Right, pre-disclosure project days, yeah.
Right, yeah. So, but when I did go back to Canada in 1989, I met up with Henry McKay, who was the MUFON director of Canada, and he told me he had other recordings of beeping sounds that were in the MUFON archives. And so I decided to meet with him and listen to the tape recordings. And sure enough, the 3 recordings that he had were identical to mine. And in the beginning, this was fascinating. Oh, good. So, there's more to this. Oh, my God. And there's some Air Force reports. They're declassified. And so it was like, well, this is exciting. Well, okay, then it really did happen. I'm not crazy. I can compare my tapes. But, oh, my God, this means that there has been other contact because people who wrote up their experiences along with their beeping sounds all had close encounters with the craft, and it was the same dimensions as the one that I had. So I realized that, now that there's more to this. It's widespread. And that's when I began to actively investigate the beeping sounds.
Right.
And I got to work with Professor Ron Stearman, who he's now retired, but he was a tenured aerospace professor out at the University at Austin, Texas. And he had some of the most sophisticated equipment in the United States at the time, and met him during a MUFON conference, and he decided to do an analysis of all the tape recordings that I had. Took it on as a project. Several years, he even got his students to do it as a project. And so I have hundreds of pages of analysis on these beeping sounds. Some of the classified Air Force reports that people called it their UFO summer. The one I thought was funny was survivors of the beep beep.
Yeah.
They were scratching their heads too.
Sure.
They lived out in the woods and were having a little difficulty integrating it into their realities.
Right. Exactly. And this is why sharing this information is so important, because people who we now have a CSETI app where you can download the protocols for contact if you have an iPhone or an iPad, and you'll see in that are these tones that we've recorded and that came from the crop circles and from the CSETI encounters are part of this app from the for iPhones. And also we have a whole program at disclosureproject.org you can get that has the DVDs and CDs with all of this. And what people find is that when they begin to use the meditation with these tones and all the protocols, that many times they'll have encounters and they'll begin to have these tones appear in their bedroom, in their house, they'll be out in the field, and they'll hear these tones, sometimes in association with the sighting of an ET vehicle, and other times not, where it'll just be in thin air and there's nothing there. You don't see a thing, but the tonality is there, which is something we'll talk about in a moment. So why don't you, if you're ready, why don't you play the tones? I know you just have it on a cassette recorder. Something that might be really good to do is Charlie Baylock, who does all our sound work and who's so good, you could take all these different tones you have and put them into an electronic MP3 type file. That would be really good to have. But why don't you go ahead and play that, and we'll let people hear what it is that you heard during your encounters in 1975.
Okay, well, this one is actually recorded in my backyard. I have several on this tape, but we'll get to that at another time.
Well, we can go through those as well, sure.
This one here
by one.
is done by Professor Purton from York University, and this was the original recording. It's about 1.5 minutes long, and it's got crickets in it. It has owls. You can hear them hooting. But he was very nervous because this is the one where we couldn't get the tape recorder going, and we had to go out of the woods to record it. So he's got his thumb rubbing on the microphone. It's very annoying, but...
Well, this is exactly what Charlie can do, is that he can take it track by track and isolate only the tone. He's a genius with this stuff. That's what I'm saying. So all that would be cleaned up. So anyway, but go ahead and play it for just maybe, a few seconds so people get a sense of what it sounds like.
Okay. I'm going to stop there. I don't know how well that's going to come out.
No, I heard it very well, and that's excellent.
These beeping sounds were heard all through the Puget Sound area in the 60s. They only happened for about 30 years, and it's been quiet now for 20 years. I have been on top of all the research. These sounds have not been heard in 20 years. The original cases started in 1962, and were happening at that point in time in the Calgary, Alberta area, and then all the way from Vancouver, BC, down to Portland, Oregon. It's really well written up in the 60s because of all the encounters that people were having with these sounds. As a matter of fact, they called in the Air Force.
Right.
And the Condon report was written up. They sent some investigators out, and they did hear the tones, and they were unable to record them, but they were sort of following them through the woods, and they were always way ahead of them, and they could just never catch up.
Well, I think what has happened, actually, just as a point of correction, is that tones very similar to those, for example, we have heard, and not always are they recorded. So I don't think that it's that they haven't occurred. They just may not have been as clear at getting recordings. And sometimes they vary. There'll be different tonality, but it's the same kind of phenomenon, such as we had at Mount Shasta just a few years ago, and I think it was 2006 or something. And actually at the disclosureproject.org, there's a CD that has these tones from a CSETI encounter. And what happened during that encounter, and this is a very important thing to understand from the point of view of, we're talking to an audience who understands the Vedas and the cities and Sanskrit, that these tones, when we were in circle out in the National Forest at Mount Shasta, and we're going to be going back there for a week at the end of August for those of you who want to join us, what happened is that we had some amazing sightings of craft that were nearby and coming between us and the mountain, Mount Shasta, and we were in the National Forest that adjoins Mount Shasta. And suddenly, I was leading a meditation where we were going into cosmic awareness and inviting the ETs to come for universal peace. And it was totally silent. Suddenly, a tone emerged from with just the space around us. Now, we just had a very inexpensive, it wasn't digital, it was a regular cassette tape recorder that a member of our team was running at the time. But what people saw, they had their eyes closed, and we were in meditation. What they experienced was that as this tone came through the area and penetrated the circle, everyone saw the shape of the craft. In other words, the craft was dematerialized, was invisible with the naked eye, because we did open our eyes when this happened. But in your mind's eye, it was like everyone saw the same spherical craft. And as it moved through, it made like a string of pearls. It was an amazing encounter. And we put a lot of these accounts that we've had in a book that came out in the past year called Contact Countdown to Transformation, and it has with it a DVD that has on it these tones as well as the pictures and images of the contact we've had. What's interesting about it is the fact that if you understand the Vedas and the Sanskrit, there's a concept called name and form, and that's where tonality precedes form and light and actually can materialize objects. And the ancient yogi masters used to be able to manifest objects through specialized states of consciousness and mantras or tones or sounds within themselves that would then bring into linear space-time a plant or a gem or whatever. And this is still doable, but extraterrestrial civilizations that go faster than the speed of light understand these transdimensional, almost celestial type sciences. And what we had this experience at Mount Shasta was that we saw clearly, everyone heard this tone, and we did record it, although the recording of it is just not the same as experiencing. I'm sure you'll testify to this, Lindy, that when you're there experiencing it, I mean, it was this penetrating tonality that literally created this image in the mind's eye of virtually everyone in this circle. And there were 30 or 40 people sitting there out in the National Forest together in a circle. And I think that what's important about that is that if you understand the science of consciousness and how consciousness and electromagnetism and all of that is integrated in these transdimensional sciences, you begin to understand how important these tones are, because the tones precede the form. And this is why, even on those encounters where you heard clearly the tones, but there was no craft visible, the craft was there. It was simply in a quote-unquote dematerialized form. It was shifted beyond the visible spectrum, but it was there, and it was contained within the tonality. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And, my mind's jumping all over the place because I was didn't know what direction I should go in. Should we go with the official report of what the beeping sounds is from the Air Force, or should we go into how they were creating crop circles in Alberta and?
Well, do you have any other tones you want to share? Other examples of them?
Right at this particular time, because of the talking that is in between all these different, it would be hard to.
No, that's okay. Yeah, at some point we can just get we'll work on this. Charlie would be great to do this and isolate these tones and put them just on a whole series, because then we can get rid of all the noise. And what you realize is that when you just hear the tones, there's a lot, and you slow them down, which is what Colin Andrews did with the crop circle tones. You hear the components of it. And it is like something from outer space. It's amazing to hear. And of course, everyone who's been there's a show that Charlie Balog and I did in the past 6 months that where we went through all these tones and discussed them. And so those are archived at the World Puja Network site. For those of you who want to hear that, you can search for that interview with conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer and Charlie Balog. But I think that what I think is really critical to this is to also connect the dots between the crop circle makers and the crop circles and the kind of language that's transcendent, sort of archetype consciousness forms at some of these crops, the ones that aren't hoaxed, and how that's connected to the sighting of ET craft and also beings as recently as last summer in England, and these tones, which of course go all the way back at least to the late 80s in England.
Oh, I mean, it's all fascinating if you look at it from different perspectives. Excuse me, I think before I mentioned how the crop circles got involved with this, or, I was going to finish saying that the big flap that was in the 60s in the Seattle area.
Oh, yes.
Over to Portland, Oregon, that it was even mentioned in Look magazine that there were so many people lining up to hear the beeps in their cars at night that if there was somebody selling beep beep dolls at a roadside stand, they would
only in America.
Really, I mean, I'd like to get a copy of that magazine, but the Air Force basically categorically said it was a saw-whet owl.
Oh yes, well they always come. That's the sound equivalent of the swamp gas that J. Allen Hynek got pilloried for saying with these sightings that were in Michigan, when of course then Congressman Ford ended up having hearings on it because everybody was so outraged. They'd seen these clearly as structured craft and objects at close range, and when he was with Project Blue Book, J. Allen Hynek, who was an astronomer, said it was made some swamp gas reference, and of course it became quite a scandal nationally. And then later, of course, he founded a research group on this and admitted that they were, actually not swamp gas, and that he eventually did a 180 and left the Air Force and came clean on all of that. So, you expect this is what governments do when they don't want a secret out, is that they concoct these. It's sort of like what Gaddafi is saying now, and his sons about, there are no protests in Libya. And meanwhile, you see the, video camera of, but it's like, how do you know they're lying? Their lips are moving. So, it is what you find with, a lot of government and political people is that, if their lips are moving, they're lying. It's just that simple. I have to laugh because recently I was interviewed by somebody who said, well, the CIA director denied he had a meeting on this subject with you. And, of course, I have a letter from them about it. And so, it's like, and he says, well, how could he say that? I said, politicians lie. Just remember, government people lie when they were trying to cover up something. So I'm not surprised the Air Force would concoct an absurd cover story for these things that are clearly not an owl hooting.
Yes, well, people were sitting up in trees with guns, and they were concerned about, the livestock and everything, so they wanted to put the whole incident to bed, so to speak. And,
right.
A saw-whet owl is 6 inches tall, and these beeping sounds were being heard for 2 miles. It was effective. It was coming over their TV sets, their radios, long wave, short wave radios, over their CBs. I have reports where forestry rangers were hearing it tower to tower. These beeping sounds were coming over their radio equipment. That's
right. And, in fact, that's another key thing. When we started using the ones from the crop circles to transmit over radio with our radio transmitters out into space when we're doing our contact, the first time I had the thought to do that, instead of just playing them into the air, was in England at Marconi's Hill, where, ironically, the first telegraph was sent to Marconi. And we were at this place, and we had seen a craft overhead, and it was like a really bright satellite. There were some people there who said, it's a satellite. And I said, well, let's ask it to do something a satellite cannot do. It made a right-hand turn and then accelerated and shot off into space. About an hour later, it got kind of drizzly and dreary the way it does in Britain, and we were up by our cars, and I was playing these crop circle tones and transmitting them over the radio signal. Now, you have to understand the way these transmitters work is that when you're transmitting, you can't receive. You have to let your finger off the button. But with it in transmission mode, the radio began to beep back from space. And then we heard this tone that sounded like that was omnidirectional all around us in the air with this mist up on top of Marconi Hill. And it was this penetrating tone. So this is part of how these tones come into the circle. And this is, everyone thinks contact just happens in sort of this kind of one-dimensional way. You see a materialized spacecraft like in a science fiction movie, but it's actually so much more interesting and elegant and nuanced and fascinating, frankly, than the sort of the caricatures that you think of when you think of the subject. And behind it is the intelligence of the people. I have to always point out to people that these are being sent and are originating from an intelligence and from civilizations that are highly developed and highly conscious, and obviously understand sciences that are transdimensional because they have to go faster than the speed of light. But when they step down and transform into linear space-time, you get all this phenomenon where you can have electromagnetic events. Like last year we were at Boca Grande Island on the Gulf of Mexico, and a man who one night was too tired to come out, he stayed in his room, and we were out on the beach having contact and amazing photographs. He asked the ETs to come into his room, and he learned these protocols, the CSETI protocols, and this brilliant blue sphere, about a foot in diameter, materialized in the room. And he asked the ETs, look, if you can appear, do something. So they did this, and then they went over to the microwave oven, turned it on, and put it in a certain sequence. And he actually couldn't get it to, he had to unplug it, the microwave. So these electromagnetic, and the lights in the room were dimming and doing all kinds of strange things. So this is the sort of things that happen all over the world that we're having with the CSETI contact protocols. And I mean, when I say thousands of accounts like this, I'm not exaggerating, with the teams that we've developed all over the world. And so these tones and understanding the tonality and how it actually can also affect awareness. People find that when they hear these tonalities, not only like compasses are affected, but there's an effect in awareness and consciousness too, if you can stay calm. It's a very powerful sort of cosmic mantra.
Yes, it's humbling, and it's endearing. I mean, I feel, because over the years I've had these type of contacts happen to me, and I've moved quite a bit, and it never fails to amaze me how they can approach you in some sort of a subconscious type of encounter. Before I forget, I was going to just mention that some of the earliest crop circles in North America happened within 50 to 75-mile radius of where these beeping sounds were reported and recorded, which is where my work with Colin Andrews comes in, because right after we all met, he started sending me everything that he had of all the crop circles in North America. And so I had an atlas of the U.S. and Canada, and I had put down all the locations of the beeping sounds, all the cases that I had collected up until that time, and he gave me the locations of the crop circles that had happened.
Right.
And I was just absolutely fascinated to find that, they're all basically in the same locations. And so I have a, good impression that those two are connected.
Right, and there's an epicenter of them also, where the tones were and the crop circles appeared in England, that also have a concentrated area. In fact, in July, we're going to be going exactly back to that area where these tones were recorded in the Wiltshire and Hampshire, England, July 24th to 31st. People who want to join us, what we're going to do is we're going to spend every day going to different new crop circles and doing meditations in them, and then at night we usually find one or two of the crop circles that we gain access to, where we sit out till 1 in the morning doing the CSETI contact protocols. And when people see, like last year when we were there, the contact we had and the images, the photographs we have of craft and objects and luminous, like you were talking about, these spheres that came very close to you, that are all around us. It's really quite amazing. And so we're going to take a group there. Those of you who want to come, you can find out about this at cseti.org. But Colin and I have often talked about how there is also something geographical with the Earth and where these tend to get centered. Anyway, so one of the epicenters is obviously in that area of England.
Well, one of the things that I found, I would go back to Ontario almost, to visit family, and I would be drawn to go back to Orton, where it started, sort of as a pilgrimage, trying to discern for myself what had happened, and to be able to tap into, that energy again.
Right.
And there were times that every time I would go up to Ontario, that there would be just, a smattering of crop circles within 2 to 3 days before I left and 2 to 3 days after I left. And I could feel the energy driving around southern Ontario, visiting family and friends, that the energy was coming down because I could feel it.
Right.
And 2002, we had a crop circle go down 2 miles north of my old homestead in Orton, Ontario. And this is on your website with my article called Second Sight. And it's sort of similar to the CSETI logo. You have the crop circle is a huge circle with 3 circles in the middle and then 3 smaller circles on the outside.
Right.
And we did a chromograph on that. And the fellow who, I guess he's a soil expert, and he took samples from that, both inside and outside, and he said that the brilliant colors that came from the barley that was put down, he said if we could duplicate the force that put this field of barley down, that we would never have to fertilize another field.
Right, exactly. And there's a message there, too, because there are technologies that they're trying to tell us are possible transdimensionally that not only could run the Earth without pollution. This is where we get into these kind of transdimensional sciences that we go into at the OrionProject.org, where we would never have to burn oil, we would never have to burn coal, but we also would never have to dump these chemicals on the land to increase the yield of crops. And this is all has to do with these kind of energies and transdimensional systems.
There's a key there somewhere.
Well, we know what it is, and we know exactly what it is. It's not somewhere it's sitting in plain sight, except the people who run the current status quo of the macroeconomic system of the world and the financial system of the world don't want this out and to be used. I mean, this is why we have to have a sort of a uprising of enlightenment where people stand together and make this change happen, which is what we're doing with the OrionProject.org and DisclosureProject.org. But I think that when you talk about that crop circle occurring when you visited there, a corollary, which I don't know if you're aware of this, Lindy, when we decided to move to this area of Virginia, the man who showed us the house, who sold us the house that we're living in now that's on 65 acres of beautiful land in the Blue Ridge Mountains, on his ancestral lands of his family, the day we decided and made the decision that we would get the property we own now, a CSETI type logo, triangular crop circle appeared, and it was on the front page of the weekly paper here, the Seaville Weekly. We didn't know about it. Other people heard about it and sent the paper to us, and I went, oh my God. And then we found out it was on this man's family's farm land that had sold us this property that we are living in now. And it was the ETs basically putting out a welcome signal to us to come here. And this kind of phenomenon and interaction is so real. It's not like, you can't make this stuff up. And if you go to our site, you'll see this Charlottesville, Virginia crop circle, which is a variation on a theme of the CSETI logo, which is 3 circles connected by lines, which, by the way, happened when I was with Colin Andrews that year in 92. We went up on Woodborough Hill and we visualized that shape. And we contacted the ETs and asked them to put it in a field if they could. And we do it politely. It's not like we're demanding it. The next morning, a farmer found exactly that shape. And if you go to cseti.org, you'll see these pictures. And one of them is our main logo is this triangle, but it was a variation on that theme that appeared in the field here in Charlottesville, and of course near your old homestead of Orton when you visited there, and of course in England where the crop circle, the original CSETI logo appeared. These things are connected. Not only the sacred geometry of these triangular and tetrahedral shapes, if you put them in the 3-dimension, but the energy form and the tonality, which manifests the form. And then that brings into it this whole concept of conscious technologies and the science of consciousness. The mantra that I'm teaching is actually a tonality that makes a triangle, if you think it in the proper tonality. And that's also at disclosureproject.org. There's a CD that has this instruction program for remote viewing and meditation. So what I tell people is that these things are all connected. These are the dots we're trying to connect in this short hour we have together. But it's very important for people to understand because this spans decades of experiences, yours, mine, Colin Andrews, and many, many other people. In fact, we just did a puja, which is a Sanskrit ceremony in the center of Joshua Tree National Park in November. And we had never done one at night out there in the park. And we were sitting there, and we had our whole group there. And right exactly, we did the puja, then we sat and did the mantra meditation, which is this tonality, this mantra that has 3 tones to it. I would say it, but you're not supposed to say it verbally. You're supposed to think it. So then we had a break later, and exactly where the puja set had been, we heard exactly the tones that were recorded from the crop circle in 1989, 21 years earlier in England. It was exactly those tones, and a whole group of, unfortunately, we didn't have any audio recording devices with us where we were standing, but we heard it clear as a bell more than once, and you know that this is not a coincidence.
Mm-hmm. And it's very personal when you hear that. It's your own what's the word? Yeah,
and they're saying we're here, we're with you, and it's really quite exciting to behold. And just as a reminder to folks, we are going to be in Crestone, Colorado. There's an 8,000-foot high valley where we go every year that has all the ashrams and the Tibetan stupa that the Dalai Lama had Ambassador George of Canada, who's a friend of ours, build. And we're going to be there from in late June of this year in Crestone, and we're also then after that in July, as I mentioned, going to be in the crop circles July 24th to the 31st in the Wiltshire, Hampshire area where all these crop circles and tones have occurred. And so these are Ambassador to the Universe training. Those of you who want to come, you can find out about them at cseti.org. And it's really exciting to make all these connections. And what I hope we can do, Lindy, is get all these various tones from spanning these decades and put them onto one master disc. And, I think that if you can get those to Charlie, he has the equipment so that we can isolate the tones from all the racket and noise and scratching of the speaker and all that stuff, which I think would be a very interesting study to have because you'd have pure digital comparisons of all these different tones from different places over different spans of decades.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be also interesting for the 3 of us to be out in the field with all the information and all the work that we've done just to see what happens.
Well, we've just been able to scratch the surface. We're about out of time, so I don't know if there's one last thing you'd like to share, Lindy, before we have to go.
Well, it just reminded me of when you and Colin were over there for that first meditation where you got your CSETI logo. I was unable to go that year, and I had prayed for a sign that I was, involved with that whole thing. And I had some transdimensional stuff happen here at home while you were actually focusing on that exact emblem there. I was wearing some 3 silver rings that actually transmuted to gold for a period of time.
Wow.
It was very peculiar, and I remember writing both you and Colin, and I put these 3 rings together in a triangle and asked if that meant anything to you.
Oh, that's right. I remember that. I said, are you kidding? Look at this. Yeah, this crop circle that appeared.
Yeah. And then Colin wrote me. So, yeah, I was connected there, too.
Yes, and what you remind me of something that's the critical thing for everyone understanding the science of consciousness and at the World Puja Network, what Erwin Schrödinger said in the early 1900s, the total number of minds in the universe is one. That is, it's a singularity, and we're all connected through that. Well, we are out of time. I would like to thank Lindy Tucker for joining us and sharing these amazing contact experiences and her great research over the years and into these tones. There's a lot more to cover, but I think that's all we have time for today, and I just want to thank you for sharing all this with everyone, Lindy.
Oh, you're welcome.
and all of your help and friendship over the years. So until next time, I'd like to thank the folks at World Puja Network for their support and all of the listeners for your interest. And until then, this is Dr. Stephen Greer with Conversations with Dr. Greer. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.